Well, welcome. I'm delighted to introduce a dear friend, Associate Fellow and former Europe Program Director at Chatham House, Hans Kundnani, who is currently also a Fellow at Remark Institute at New York University, and he's joining me from New York, so I'm delighted. Thanks for taking your time. Thanks for accepting this invitation. I want to ask a big question. What is wrong with the European Union as it is now? And can it be fixed? How can it be fixed?
Okay. Well, thanks for having me, Stefan. It's great to see you again. What's wrong with the EU? That is quite a difficult question to answer, actually, because I think there are different dimensions of what's wrong with the EU. I think the place I would probably start is that it is from a sort of democratic perspective. It does seem to me that the EU is problematic from a democratic perspective. It's very difficult, I think, to fit the EU's sort of system of institutions into something that's recognizable from democratic theory. The democratic nation states in particular. And I think in general, my impression is that a lot of the discussion about democracy in the EU, I mean, they used to be, a big discussion about, the democratic problems with the EU, particularly around the idea of a democratic deficit. My sense is that in the last sort of decade or so, we've become so preoccupied with the problems of democracy within Hungary and Poland that we've almost forgotten about, I think the deeper democratic problems with the EU itself, to which I think a lot of what we've seen in Hungary and Poland is itself a response. So I think, in that sense, the discussion about the problems with the EU from a democratic point of view have gone sort of backwards. And in general, I think my sense is that what tends to happen in discussions of this is that people sort of adjust their idea of democracy to suit the EU rather than, trying to, make the EU fit something that's democratic and in a more recognizable kind of way. So I think I would say that's the biggest problem with the EU. There are lots of other problems that we could talk about, whether it's to do with the economic policy of the EU and the sort of distributional consequences of that, or whether it's to do with the EU's relationship with the rest of the world. But I think, for me, the fundamental problem and the way to solve the other problems, is this question of the lack of democracy in the EU. So whether I'm not quite sure if the right way to describe the EU is as being non-democratic or anti-democratic. We can debate that. But I think, as I say, it is quite difficult to reconcile, for me at least, the EU with what I understand by democracy. And I'll maybe just, I always think of the quote from Ulrich Beck, who was not at all a Eurosceptic. He's very much a pro-European. And even Ulrich Beck said that if the EU were to apply to join the EU, it wouldn't be allowed to because it's not a democracy.
Yeah. So yeah, there is a lot there, and I would like to unpack it. So you mentioned the problem of kind of what is commonly referred to as democratic backsliding amongst the new member states, Poland and Hungary. Hungary in particular, that's seen as a kind of illiberal democracy under Prime Minister Viktor Orban, and you say that the focus on Hungary tends to obscure the difficulties that the EU itself has. And of course, there is also a large body of academic literature about democratic deficit, but oftentimes it is assumed that if only people learned more about the EU, they will also learn to love the EU. And I learned from your most recent book that your trajectory seems to defy that trend, because you self-described there as someone who was very pro-EU, and then the more you learned about it, the more skeptical you became. Do you want to explain that?
Yeah, absolutely. And but I should say as well that I'm not the only one. I mean, I think this is actually quite a common experience. You know, and so I think there is this tendency, and as I say, I embodied this, that, you know, people thinking that the EU is just a good thing, it's a force for good, without really knowing that much about it, right? And then, you know, I think for a lot of people, frankly, the more you actually look into the history of the EU and the reality of the EU, actually you become more critical of it. So in my case, you know, I think I used to be what would be called a Euro-Atlanticist. You know, in other words, a believer both in you know, in European integration and you know, the Atlantic Alliance, and this sense that they're somehow linked in a way, part of the same project. Hence, you know, the Euro-Atlantic project. And then I spent 6 years working at the European Council on Foreign Relations, a very pro-European foreign policy think tank, whose aim is to help the EU develop a more coherent, effective foreign policy. And when I joined ECFR in 2009, as I say, I thought of myself as a pro-European, and saw the EU as a force for good, both internally within Europe and in the world. But actually, in retrospect, I didn't know that much about the EU, actually. I thought I did, but actually I didn't. And so during the 6 years or so that I worked there, from about 2009 to about 2015, I started to understand, I think, what the EU really is, the real existing EU, as opposed to this sort of imaginary EU. And as I say, I became more Eurosceptic over time, to the point then when, you know, the referendum happened in the UK in 2016. I voted Remain, but I was already, the way I often put this is, I was already at the sort of, you know, the kind of Eurosceptic end of the Remain side of the argument in the UK. So I was quite close, actually, to, you know, it didn't seem to me obvious that Britain should remain in the EU, but I did vote to remain. And then I think since then, I've become even more Eurosceptic. I think the other thing I should emphasize, though, is that, you know, as well as my perceptions of the EU changing as I learned more about it during that period, I think the EU was also sort of objectively changing as well. So this was very much, you know, the period. You know, it was the Euro crisis that began in 2010. Then the other series of crises that followed that. You know, then as they culminating in Brexit, in the Brexit vote, at least in 2016. And in a way, part of the process for me of writing that book was precisely to kind of disentangle in my own mind how much of, you know, my changing views of the EU had to do with me, as I say, just learning more about it, and you know, my subjective perceptions changing, and how much of this was about, you know, the EU objectively changing. And you know, I think it's a bit of both, but you know, I think it's important to emphasize that you know, I think the EU, for me at least, the EU has been evolving in a troubling kind of way, especially since the Euro crisis began in 2010.
Sorry, now a technical comment. I just, the connection is very good, but the camera is wobbly, and I don't know whether it's just that as you lean on the table.
My table is a little bit wobbly.
So maybe you just don't touch the table, if that's possible. But I don't know.
Yeah.
You know, you are leaning on the table. Maybe if you just don't lean on the table.
Yeah.
Sorry
Okay.
about that. I'll resume, right? I think that's all been good. Yeah, that's excellent. Sorry about that.
It's okay.
Well, I would like to move closer to the present times. We talk about the last 10 years, and you have researched and written a lot about Germany, and Germany as a kind of reluctant leader of Europe, and yet Germany's position in Europe is linked to France, right? So it's the famous Franco-German engine. Is that Franco-German engine still working? It seems that on a number of policies, whether you look at energy security, even Ukraine to some extent, the two countries have widely diverging positions. Where do you see France and Germany working together or not?
Yeah, I'm not sure that on Ukraine they are that far apart, but we can come back to that. I think the way that I think about this was that, you know, clearly at the beginning of the European project in the 1950s, and then, you know, really through until the end of the Cold War, you know, the Franco-German tandem, or whatever you want to call it, you know, was the sort of center of what was then the EEC or the EC. But I think that the decisive moment that changed the role of the Franco-German relationship was actually the enlargement of the EU in 2004. And I think that after that point, you know, it was often said that, you know, the way to get a kind of compromise between EU member states was for France and Germany to reach a sort of bilateral compromise. And then, you know, the other EU member states, their positions would be somewhere between the German position and the French position. And so a compromise between France and Germany would sort of make everybody happy. But I think everything changed with enlargement because it meant that you had this new kind of east-west fault line within the EU, which, you know, I'm sure we'll come back to, you know, discussing Ukraine, where that becomes quite significant. But I think for me that the moment when this becomes really apparent is the Iraq War in 2003, right? Where, you know, Donald Rumsfeld, at the time the US Defense Secretary, you know, coins this kind of distinction between old Europe and new Europe. And by the way, one of the interesting things about that is that, you know, I think the UK, at least, you know, at that moment, the UK is with New Europe, actually, right? So in a way, the contrast is not so much between the Central and Eastern European countries, you know, on the one hand, and sort of Western Europe on the other hand, but it is more kind of almost literally how Rumsfeld meant it, which is the founding six, and then the new member state, new Europe, in the sense of the countries that subsequently joined, and Britain, but also Spain, which also, you know, was on the, you know, American side, as it were, of that argument in the Iraq War. You know, it also joined the EU later on. So that fault line becomes very clear. And I think what also becomes clear is that, you know, France and Germany almost try to re-establish their leadership by sort of opposing the Iraq War and trying to bring the rest of Europe with them, and they fail. So I think that's roughly now still where we are, which is that, you know, obviously it's true that you can't really do anything in the European Union if France and Germany don't agree. But even if France and Germany do agree, that's no longer a sufficient condition to get anything done in the EU, because often, as I say, the Central and Eastern European countries will look at this in a totally different way. So it's no longer the case that all of the EU member states are sort of located somewhere between the French position and the German position. Often it's actually that France and Germany are on one side of the argument and Central and Eastern European countries on the other. One final thing, though, I should add on that is I do think we need to be a little bit cautious. I mean, I should be a little bit cautious about generalizing about Central and Eastern European countries because, you know, often there's a huge difference between the positions of Central and Eastern European countries too. And often we have these discussions where, you know, we almost make it sound as if in relation to Russia, you know, the Western Europeans are quite dovish and, you know, the Central and Eastern Europeans are really hawkish. But if you look at the most pro-Russian countries in the EU, it's Central and Eastern European countries like Hungary and now your country, Slovakia.
Yes.
You know, so actually, you know, it doesn't quite the fault line isn't quite as clear as we sometimes kind of imagine that it is.
Yeah. Well, the way I see it is that there are divisions, kind of geographic and political divisions across Europe, but then also these divisions are reflected within every one of the member states. And Slovakia, that you just mentioned, is a perfect example of it, because until quite recently, and it so happens that we are recording this on the 1st of May, 2024, which means exactly 20 years after the enlargement that you just pointed out was so hugely significant. Yes, but so Slovakia until quite recently was very staunchly pro-Ukrainian, but the new Prime Minister, Robert Fico, who gained the support of the majority of Slovak voters, is much more lukewarm towards Ukraine and seems sympathetic towards Russia. So the cliche that Central Europe is kind of pro-Ukrainian, as you say, doesn't quite work. And that is one topic I want to discuss with you, whether that war that in my view Russia started by invading Ukraine, whether that war would work as a kind of unifying factor, pushing the European integration forward, or whether it will be the source of further divisions. But before going there, I want to unpack one aspect that we touched on already, and that is whether the EU or Brussels or the community of these member states can do anything, and if what, in relation to what are kind of concerning developments in countries like Hungary or even in Slovakia right now in terms of constraining the freedom of the media and some aspects, degradation of the rule of law state, etc. So whether the EU is in a position to do anything about these populist rebellions. And you just pointed out that there is a kind of dialectical relationship, that it is partly the response to what is oftentimes rightly perceived as an undemocratic Europe, right? That people rebel against and vote for someone like Robert Fico in Slovakia or Viktor Orban in Hungary. But now that they are in power, can the EU do much about that? And should they do anything about it? That's another question.
Yeah, it's difficult. So, the way I think about this is that, for the last decade or so, especially since 2016, the concept of populism, has dominated our political discourse so much. And I think in many ways it's been really, really unhelpful, mainly because of the way in which it sort of flattens out the differences between all of these different figures and movements and parties that we call populist, or in the case of Brexit, a decision which we think of as being populist, right? I think it's virtually meaningless, actually. But we've come to sort of think of, all of these different figures and movements and parties as following the same, quote, populist playbook, whereas actually I think these are very, very different, cases, actually, even within Europe, let alone before we get on to, Turkey and India and all kinds of other places where we talk about, populists.
I think on Brexit, we are in agreement that this was a popular decision of the people of the Great Britain, right? And then the people who were unhappy about that popular decision describe it as populist to delegitimize it, right? And so then, yeah, I completely support your point.
Yeah, I mean, I think
vastly different political phenomena are kind of described with that one overarching label. It's unhelpful.
I think what makes it difficult is that, whenever one of these populist figures or movements or parties is elected, obviously people have different reasons for voting for them. So there's a sort of certain heterogeneity among, first of all, there's often a gap between what political entrepreneurs are sort of offering and what voters are voting for, right? But then there's such a heterogeneity in terms of these voters. And, I'm not denying that in each of these cases, whether it's Trump or Orban or even Brexit, that there are some people, who did basically, vote for all of the reasons that people say they did, whether they were racist or whatever it is. But the problem is that, as I say, it's complex because different people were voting for different reasons. And the way I think of Brexit is that the coalition that voted for Brexit is even more heterogeneous than the coalition that, say, voted for Trump or voted for Orban. Because in the case of Brexit, they weren't being offered, there wasn't a manifesto that, a particular party stood on. It was just this, binary decision, leave or remain. And then, there were several leave campaigns, all kind of saying different things. And so I think it's just even more difficult in the case of Brexit to generalize about what voters wanted. So, here in the US, where I now am, when I try to sort of explain to people that, Brexit does not equal Trump, right? It's not the same thing as Trump. One of the things I say is, well, at a very minimum, you'd have to say that Brexit equals Trump plus Sanders, right? Yeah. Bernie Sanders, because there were also left-wing, reasons for voting for Brexit.
Of course.
And that tends to get kind of dismissed as well.
And I interviewed Chris Bickerton discussing it, that was left-wing cause for Brexit. But back to Central Europe,
Yes,
right?
sorry, yes,
US
I've
is too far
distracted you.
away, and I actually derailed your train of thought by reminding you of Brexit. So back to Central Europe and the populism.
Yeah. So
there.
can the
Is there
EU do
anything
anything
the
about
EU, and
democratic
should they
backsliding?
do anything about
Yeah.
it?
So yeah, so I think of this in terms of I think of populism, at least within the EU, as being to a large extent a response to technocracy. There's this kind of sort of dialectical or symbiotic relationship between technocracy and populism. And technocracy is often, sorry, populism is often a response to technocracy. And another way of thinking about that is, as I think you sort of hinted at earlier on, that you can see, illiberal democracy, which is another way that we often think of someone like Orban, as being a response to undemocratic liberalism. This is an argument, for example, that Cas Mudde, one of the leading experts on populism and the far right, has made. So I think I worry a bit that this focus on the problems of democratic backsliding in Hungary and Poland is sort of focusing on a sort of symptom rather than on the real problem itself. And I think the real problem itself is how the way I think about this is that there's a certain tension in a liberal democracy between liberalism on the one hand and democracy on the other hand. People often tend to use liberalism and democracy almost as if they're synonyms, but they're absolutely not. And in a liberal democracy, as I say, there's a tension between the two things. If we think of democracy as being, popular sovereignty embodied in free and fair elections, and then you think of liberalism as a system of individual rights guaranteed by a constitution, which insofar as they can be changed, it's through the courts, right? There's a certain tension between those two things, and in particular, the question then becomes, what areas of policy do we want to take out of the popular pillar of liberal democracy, right? In other words, out of the space of democratic contestation, where voters, if there's a majority of them, they can change these things, and put them in this constitutional pillar of democracy, where they can't really be changed except if you have a supermajority, in your legislature or through the courts. And I think I would argue that I think part of what the populists or the illiberal Democrats are saying across Europe is that balance has gone wrong, right? That too many things have been taken out of the popular pillar of democracy and brought into the constitutional pillar. And they want to bring them back into the popular pillar. In other words, to bring them back into the space of democratic contestation. And there's a lot of work, which you're familiar with, around how precisely that how the EU tends to sort of over-constitutionalize, right? That it tends to bring things which normally in a nation state would be in the space of democratic contestation. It tends to bring them into the constitutional pillar of democracy, where you can't really change them through through elections. As I say, you can only change them through the courts. And in particular, the biggest problematic example of that over-constitutionalization is economic policy, which in the context of the Eurozone, you have the fiscal rules, which essentially take economic policy out of the space of democratic contestation. So that, I think, is probably the most crucial. That's the way I think about it. And that's, I think, the most crucial kind of battleground in a way is around these economic questions. But then on top of that, a lot of what people like Orban are talking about is not so much the economic questions, but more these questions around, things like media freedom and so on. And there, the balance, is even trickier, I suppose. The problem, I think, and again, you've written about this very eloquently, is that this is framed in terms of the rule of law. But actually, the rule of law is quite a specific idea in legal theory. And what the EU does, I think, is it slightly abuses that concept of the rule of law. And it slightly collapses it into the idea of, well, we're just going to set some rules and everybody has to follow them. That's not quite what the rule of law is. I mean, as I say, you know this better than I do. And so my reading of Hungary and Poland, Hungary especially, is that that's partly what they're pushing back against, is what they see as a sort of arbitrary and unconstitutional extension of the EU's own powers by itself, right? So, you'll remember the Polish foreign minister, I think quite persuasively, argued that the EU was itself, in its attempts to enforce the rule of law, was itself overstepping the rule of law,
Yes.
right? And sort of creating arbitrary rules and expanding its powers.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's a very long way of saying, I think these are quite difficult questions. But I suppose my position is that, the Hungarians and the Poles, have had a point at times in terms of what they see as being the EU's kind of overstretch.
Yeah, so I could summarize it, I suppose, in a couple of sentences. That is to say that if illiberal democracy is a response to undemocratic liberalism, then doubling down on undemocratic liberalism is not really going to address the problem that we are dealing with. And what you described, I mean, as you said, I mean, it has been now debated within political science, even within legal theory. I'm thinking of a recent study by Martin Laughlin, a brilliant British scholar of constitutionalism, and he writes, he calls his book Against Constitutionalism, right? Highlighting the kind of problems that he sees actually all Western democracies experiencing, but the EU perhaps more than any others. But there is one term that you mentioned there that I want to develop further now in relation to Ukraine and the war that Russia wages against Ukraine and the EU's position on Ukraine and the individual member states' position on Ukraine, because you talk about popular sovereignty. And it strikes me, this is one of the big themes of your book, right? That it strikes me that there is a kind of contradiction there in which EU elites and say particularly politicians in Germany and France think of the EU as a kind of post-national, even cosmopolitan, post-sovereign project, and yet they are all Ukrainian nationalists now. If you allow me to be kind of crude in their description, they are all passionately supporting Ukrainian fight for national sovereignty, which many Ukrainians also see as a fight for Europe. And you see Ursula von der Leyen really being ecstatic about this juxtaposition, right? That Ukrainians are fighting for Europe. But there is an inner tension in that position, right? How do you view that?
Yeah, well, I would say there are two contradictions. And this is something that I've been very struck by since February 2022, when the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine took place. The first is, I think, the one you mentioned, which is that around this question of well, it's popular sovereignty, but also national sovereignty, right? And in a way, this brings us back to the Brexit question again, because I think a lot of people in the EU overlooked was that they saw Brexit as being all about an assertion of national sovereignty, but it was as much an assertion of popular sovereignty, I think, and this kind of instinct, whether you agree with it or not, that national sovereignty and popular sovereignty go together, right? They're very tightly connected, and that you can't really have popular sovereignty except within the nation state. As I say, you don't have to agree with that position, but I think that's roughly what Leavers, that's roughly what the position that Leavers were expressing. So I've been very struck by how, pro-Europeans, and the EU itself, historically were opposed to the idea of sovereignty, right? That's precisely what the EU was meant to sort of overcome, was not just national sovereignty, but the concept of sovereignty in general. Right? If you look at what a lot of pro-Europeans were writing in the 1990s and 2000s, it was about overcoming the concept of sovereignty in general, not just national sovereignty. And so then obviously when something like Brexit comes along, or other, in other EU member states, populist figures and movements and parties who emphasize national sovereignty, it's not surprising that pro-Europeans would reject that. But what I think has been surprising has been to see this emergence of the concept of European sovereignty during the last decade, which I think is, by the way, partly a response by the EU to the rise of populism. The sense that, oh, it turns out people care about sovereignty, and so we have to start talking the language of sovereignty too. But in contrast to these people who believe in national sovereignty, we're going to talk about European sovereignty. And to me, the very striking thing there is how a lot of pro-Europeans seem to imagine that, something which they saw as being very problematic at a national level is sort of magically unproblematic if you upload it to the European level, right? So European sovereignty is totally fine, even if, national sovereignty is not. But then, as you say, this is the contradiction which I think has come out since the war in Ukraine began, is now, bizarrely, you see pro-Europeans not just talking about European sovereignty, but embracing the idea of Ukrainian national sovereignty and Ukrainian nationalism. I mean, in particular, the way that, Ukrainian flags, are being now waved by pro-Europeans, I think in an extraordinary way. And, it is kind of interesting that the colors, blue and yellow, are the same as the EU flag. So it kind of fits in a way into this idea of, the idea that there's sort of no contradiction, I suppose. There's this seamless continuity between Ukrainian nationalism and European sovereignty. But nevertheless, it is bizarre to me to see so many pro-Europeans suddenly become nationalists and believe in nationalism. That I find, quite extraordinary. And then I think the second, kind of contradiction, which is kind of related to that, is, this way in which, the concept of European values has changed since 2022. I mean, European values, can mean basically whatever you want it to mean. But I found it very bizarre to see, a lot of pro-Europeans, people like Ursula von der Leyen, suddenly talking about territorial sovereignty as being a European value. This is, as I say, in a way, precisely what the EU was meant to overcome, was the idea of territorial sovereignty. It was trying to blur, the distinctions between in and out, between different jurisdictions. And so to sort of see suddenly the defense of territorial sovereignty, territorial integrity, and national sovereignty as being a European value is very bizarre. But I think it sort of illustrates that sort of the elasticity of this idea of European values. It can really mean whatever you want it to mean.
Now, another aspect of that war that I want you to reflect on is whether, and again, and you wrote about it extensively in your most recent book. That, I mean, you talk about Europe as a kind of example of regional nationalism, right? And so identity matters for that. And with identity building, it helps to have what is called constitutive other in literature, right? So the other strengthen your sense of who you really are, defining yourself against the other. I mean, at gender level, you can say, I'm a man, not a woman. I'm a lecturer, not a student. I tell my students, right? And some of those divisions are benign, right? I tell my students that as a lecturer, I am a student too, right? That's a benign distinction and division, but it exists. Others might be more serious, and in times of war, of course. So Russia is the enemy, right? For many Europeans, Russia is the enemy. For Ukrainians, most certainly. But the extent to which Europeans see Russia as a problem, as an enemy, differs widely. I mean, that's conditioned by geography. That is where I do think that some of those simplifications do make sense, right? Like for Poland, Russia will always be an existential threat. If you are in Spain or in Portugal, you don't perceive it in that way, Ivan Krastev wrote beautifully, Europeans can have common dreams, right? European unity might be a sort of dream along those lines, but their nightmares are strictly national, right? So the nightmares that Poland has are very different from the one that I don't know, people in France might have. So will the war lead to more unity, you know, and that's the traditional story, right? Every crisis in Europe leads to more unity. It's through crisis that we get stronger as Europeans. Or will it, in fact, lead to further disintegration?
Right. Okay. First of all, it's a really interesting question. So I think I think I don't quite buy Krastev's point that our nightmares are all national, because I think there is a collective European nightmare as well, which I'll come on to in a minute.
That's the book, right? That's at the heart of the book, actually. Yes, yes, good point. Sorry.
No. But I'll come back to that in a minute. By the way, I'm also not entirely convinced of this kind of idea that, you know, it's clearly true that we all look at Russia in different ways in different European countries, but I think I'm a little bit kind of skeptical of this idea that proximity to Russia makes you more hawkish.
Yes, and again, you mentioned Slovakia already, and I probably should rephrase my question, because I also stated in that question, I made an assumption that it's not so easily supported that everyone sees Russia as an enemy. So clearly, not even Robert Fico, the Slovak prime minister, necessarily sees Russia as an enemy, right? So,
but also conversely, you know, that's true. But I was going to bring up the converse example, and sorry to keep coming back to Britain here, but if you look at geography, Britain ought to be the least hawkish country on Russia.
Yes,
right? Because it's the furthest away. I mean, it's even further away than France and Germany.
Yes.
And yet, Britain is probably the most hawkish country. I mean, it's basically as hawkish as Poland and the Baltic states,
Yes.
right? And so I don't think this is quite just a function of geography. It's more complicated than that, I think. But anyway, let me put that to one side. I want to come back to this question of, you know, the direct question you asked me, which is, will the war in Ukraine produce more unity or not? And here, you know, again, I slightly want to not turn the question on its head, but on its side, in the sense that, you know, it's really not obvious to me that European unity is a good thing. I don't think it's obvious that it's a good thing. I think it can be a good thing, but sometimes it's a bad thing. And this brings me back to this kind of idea of a shared European nightmare, which I'll come back to again. You know, European unity around a really bad policy, I think, is a bad thing. And then I'd rather have European disunity. And certainly from the perspective of the rest of the world, I mean, European unity may be good for Europeans. I don't even think it's always good for Europeans. But certainly from the perspective of the rest of the world, when Europeans are united, that's often not good news for the rest of the world. You know, so I think it's worth us just taking a little bit of a step back. I mean, you're teaching in Hong Kong, right? You know, I think from a lot of other parts of the world, they don't think it's automatically a good thing for Europeans to be united. It all depends on what Europeans are united around. And that also then brings me to this question of, you know, this idea that you mentioned around, you know, Europe develops in crises. Now, again, I'm not entirely convinced that there is a correlation between, you know, these moments of crises and then steps forward in European integration. Actually, if you look at the big moments in European integration, they haven't been, you know, at moments of big crises. You know, and often there have been moments of crises that haven't produced steps in integration. But even if it's true that crises do somehow push the EU to move, to integrate whatever, again, it's not always in a positive way. So, you know, even if there is further European integration, it's not obvious that's a good thing. So I think that Monnet quote is quite interesting when he says, you know, Europe will be the sum total of its crises. And I always thought,
no, what he said was solutions to the crises that
okay, the solutions, but it's the sum total bit that I'm interested in, because it always struck me as being possible that it's a negative sum. Right? Even if Monnet is right that Europe will be, you know, what Europe is a function of these crises, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing, right? It could be that these crises push Europe to evolve in a really bad way, and that's part of my argument in the book. So, so then to get to your question around, you know, whether the war in Ukraine will produce more unity, I think the way I think about what's happened since the Russian invasion in February 22 is not just Europe, but the West has been very united. This has been something that a lot of people have celebrated, right? Turns out we were much more united than Putin thought we were going to be. He had sort of bet on the fact that we would be divided, but it turns out we were actually quite united. And I think there is some truth to that, that the West has been quite united, relatively during the last 2 years. But I think there's been a price that has been paid for that, which is that the West has been united, but it's cut itself off from the rest of the world, in particular from the global South. So the way I think about what's happened in the last 2 years is the West has turned in on itself. It's become more united internally, but the gap between the West, by which I basically mean Europe and the United States, and other US treaty allies, so it's basically the US alliance system, the gulf between them and the global South has deepened, I think. And I think that's a massive problem.
Well, actually, I can't help thinking that this is partly the argument that Robert Fico, the Slovak prime minister, made quite recently when he tried to criticize the positions that both Brussels and Washington and London, in fact, have taken on Russia. Can I ask you, I'll just have one more question, but your camera cuts off your head. So we will cut off this comment, but if you just, yeah, good. What you said about the unity of the West and how it alienates the West from the rest of the world is a problem for the West, and perhaps even more so for Ukraine, because Ukraine does not get the kind of support that it would need to prevail over Russia globally, right? So the West is not as unifying outside of the West, I suppose, in its position on Russia. But how do you see then that conflict developing, and how do you see its impact on Europe? So we established that you don't think of European unity as a good in its own right, and I think we have the same positions on Europe in that respect. But yeah, how do you see then? And that's the last question, and it's the question we don't know the future, but we can perhaps contemplate plausible scenarios, desirable scenarios, catastrophic scenarios. So if you can reflect on Europe's future and the place that Ukraine will find in that European future over the next 5 or 10 years.
Yeah. Well, I guess everything depends on, the outcome of the war in military terms, right? So if we start there, because I think it's very difficult to talk about a sort of, what Europe might look like after the war in Ukraine, without a sense of how the war ends, right? And so if we start there, it does seem to me actually increasingly clear now, because there's basically a stalemate, or in the best case scenario, actually, there's a stalemate, from the Western point of view, because it could be that actually Russia over the next few months makes some quite significant gains. But I guess I'm rather skeptical, and I have been, from very early on in the war, that it's feasible, for Ukraine to regain much of the territory that it's now lost. I think that's just the realities of this war. And I know a lot of the, hawks will say, oh, well, they would be capable of regaining territory if we gave them, lots more weapon systems. We could argue about the risks of that. I think the idea that you defeat Russia, I've never been quite sure what that looks like, and people who talk about Ukrainian victory or Russian defeat, often what they mean is basically regime change in Moscow. Yeah. Either a complete collapse of, the Russian military and perhaps, Russian political system and as I say, regime change. I'm not very sanguine
I
about
mean,
that.
that is where we have had disagreement, right? Because I mean, I kind of think, but that disagreement will never be resolved, or it might be resolved in 10, 20 years, because it's impossible to know what might have been, right? So for me, the feeling I
Counterfactual,
have,
yeah.
there has been the unity of the West, but they're always over-promising to Ukraine and under-delivering. So if Ukrainians were better equipped to really, capitalize on those early victories, when they managed to push back Russians from around Kiev, etc., right? Then they might have made some impact, and it is not inconceivable to imagine that that would have developed further. But on the current development, I think we are in agreement. I don't think it is. Yeah, I don't see how people can feel still optimistic about Ukraine's military prospects right now.
But let's explore that a little bit more. I mean, so let's say during that earlier phase, the United States and European countries had provided with Ukraine with a lot more weapon systems that they were hesitating to do. Then what's the scenario that you envisaged there? Was it that that Russia would be pushed out of of eastern, completely out of eastern Ukraine and perhaps Crimea even, and that Putin would accept that, and that Putin would remain in power, and there's somehow a sort of smooth end to the war? I find that very difficult to imagine.
Yeah, I agree. It's not easy to think that through, but it's also not true to say that Russia never lost, right? Like the Soviet Union, was defeated in Afghanistan, and the consequences of that eventually were kind of, it led to a regime change. So yeah, I also don't.
I think
Yeah.
that's right, Stefan. But Ukraine is not Afghanistan, right?
Yes. Yes.
So
Of
it
course.
seems
Of
to me
course.
that
Yeah. Yeah.
the
Yeah.
defeat in Afghanistan was bad enough for the Soviet Union, but I think it could just about kind of extract itself from that in the way that the US did from Vietnam.
Yeah, but I mean, Putin's
Ukraine,
ability.
I think it's very difficult to see how,
Yes.
if you did have this Western or Ukrainian victory in Ukraine, I think it's very difficult to see then how Putin somehow remains in power.
Well, but
And so
that is what the hope was of the
so,
collective
so this,
West, that
this
Putin's power base would be
so
completely
this
undermined.
is
But I
this is
mean,
what
but Hans, I mean, we can go through that for another hour, and I don't want to do it. But like even when you think contingencies, right? Like Prigozhin almost marched into Moscow, and Prigozhin was someone who was worse than Putin, right? So I am not upset about him not having prevailed. But that was one moment in very recent Russian history where you could see that Putin's regime was not as unassailable and unshakable as it often seems. But yeah, I
I'm not
personally I
saying it is
think these opportunities, if they existed in the very first year of the war, and I think we are way past it now.
I'm not saying that Putin is unassailable. I'm not saying that at all.
Yeah.
The point I'm making is that I think the position of a lot of hawks
Mm.
actually is a regime change position, and
Yes.
they're not fully open about that.
Yes, yes. I think
But what
the
they're
West,
actually
no one
saying,
in the West has ever spelled out the proper strategy. And again, I suppose that the problem for good Europeans, for pro-Europeans, is that people like Orban say it very publicly, that the West has no strategy, right? And I think on substance, he has a valid point. And again, I watched a very recent interview with Robert Fico, whom I detest. He's really an authoritarian. But when he analyzed Brussels' position on Ukraine, he made points that you just made, that the rest of the world doesn't see the conflict in this way, and there are major countries. He cited Brazil, he cited India, who don't see it in those ways. And so for liberals in Slovakia to berate Fico said that he doesn't know what he's talking about. They are deluding themselves. It's Brussels that is quite isolated with its position. But let's go back then to the present.
yeah.
And I kind of interrupted you there, so my apologies. But yeah, so I think we are in agreement that unfortunately it looks like a stalemate, and we don't know whether it will continue like this for months, years, or a decade. And so then it's difficult to contemplate what is post-war future when we don't even know whether and how the war will end. But if you think through those scenarios.
Yeah. So I think that roughly what we're looking at is a scenario where Ukraine, basically, I was going to say, gives up some territory, but it's already lost that territory, right? So it's really it's not going to regain it, and so it's accepting on some level that territory is no longer part of Ukraine, even if it doesn't do it formally. That's, I think, basically how this war will end, whether it's, in a year's time or in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. And I would rather see it end sooner rather than later. But I think that is the basic reality, is that Ukraine is not going to regain much territory. So then the question becomes, and lots of people have obviously written about this, then what could victory look like for Ukraine, that doesn't involve, regaining all of the territory it's lost? And people then obviously immediately start to think about EU accession, perhaps NATO accession. I'm a bit worried, frankly, about both of those prospects for slightly different reasons in each case. I think NATO, Ukraine joining NATO, I think is that worries me for basically security reasons. And then in terms of the question of EU accession, which is maybe the one we should talk more about since we're talking about the EU here, there I worry about, I'm not a big, fan of the idea of Ukraine joining the EU for a couple of different reasons. One is that, I guess this is basically the French position, which is that, the EU is already, and you might agree with me here, is already pretty dysfunctional. And I think bringing Ukraine in makes it more dysfunctional without a massive reform of the way the EU functions, which is very difficult to see how you do. We've been struggling with this since at least 2010. And because of the rise of Euroscepticism, it's quite difficult to think about treaty change. So it's really difficult to think about how you reform the EU. And and if you further enlarge the EU without reforming it, I think it becomes even less functional than it currently is. But then there's a second reason why I'm quite opposed to Ukraine joining the EU, which I guess is from more of a political perspective. And this brings us back to the question of the EU enlargement, to include Central and Eastern European countries in the 2000s. As somebody on the left, I think it's very clear that the accession of Central and Eastern European countries has pulled the EU to the right, in cultural terms and in economic terms. In economic terms, it strengthened that bloc of countries that's basically economically liberal, opposed to sort of French kind of economic plans for the EU. And then, as I say, in cultural terms, it strengthened this, idea, which I write a lot about in the book, this idea of a sort of white Christian Europe. That's clearly been strengthened by the accession of Central and Eastern European countries. And I think that the accession of Ukraine will do that on an even bigger scale. Not least because this is a country which would have been at war. And as we've been discussing already, I think the problem of Ukrainian nationalism, I would say hyper-nationalism, is a real one. There's a very problematic history of Ukrainian nationalism, which we haven't been allowed to really talk about since 2022, involving the far right. But more than that, even if that weren't a problem, I just think this is a time bomb, in the sense that you're bringing into the EU a very large country, which, as we were discussing earlier on, has just been fighting a war for its own national sovereignty. Yeah. And to expect that country then to roll over and, give up its national sovereignty, or pool its national sovereignty in the EU, I just think that's even less likely to happen than it was in other Central and Eastern European countries. And I think that's part of the problem we're now dealing with in Hungary and Poland, is that these countries, regained their sovereignty after the end of the Cold War, and then immediately were expected to surrender it to this rather undemocratic EU. And I think that's part of, as we discussed earlier, why you have a backlash against it. And what I imagine happening with Ukraine is that on an even bigger scale. So I do think it's kind of a time bomb for the EU, actually. I know that's a very unpopular position, but that's how I see it.
Thank you very much, Hans Kundnani. We ended where we started, about EU's democracy and Europe's commitment to democracy. That was a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stefan.